Good evening, everyone. It's now 7:30, so we may get this show on the road, and I'm sure others will continue to log in here. My name is Aidan Fishman. I am a lawyer at the Toronto office of Borden, Ladner, Gervais, LLP, sometimes known as Canada's law firm, and I'll be moderating this debate tonight on behalf of B'nai B'rith Canada. Before we get to the debate proper, I want to introduce the format and some ground rules. The first question some of you may be asking is, why is my favorite candidate or your least favorite candidate not in attendance tonight? And the answer is that for this year's suite of debates, B'nai B'rith Canada has followed the same invitation rules in terms of parties as the official Canadian Debates Commission. Candidates from all of those parties were invited to this debate, and the two of them who confirmed in time are here right in front of you. And I was doing a little historical research, and it turns out really well for us anyways, because since the riding of Thornhill was created, it has been won in every election by a Liberal or Conservative candidate. And in fact, in every year, the Liberal or Conservative candidates finished either first or second, respectively. So I think we're in good hands tonight. Before I get to the format for tonight's debate, there are some messages to pass on behalf of B'nai B'rith Canada. The first one, Canada has an official elections guide to all of the issues and all of the main parties in this year's election. If you just Google B'nai B'rith Canada elections guide, you'll find it, or I'm sure a link will be posted at some point in the chat. What you can also see already posted in the chat, and what some of you may have seen as you're waiting on the screen, is another campaign B'nai B'rith is running. And the message there is, no matter who you vote for in this election, B'nai B'rith Canada wants you to vote no to Ben & Jerry's ice cream, following the anti-Semitism allegations dodging that organization over its recent activities. And in particular, B'nai B'rith is running a campaign where you can write to your local grocer and urge them not to carry Ben & Jerry's ice cream products until Ben & Jerry's rescinds its anti-Semitic boycott. And there are some hyperlinks to that in the chat if you're looking for it. In terms of the format tonight, we're going to have opening statements from each of the two candidates for 2 minutes each, followed by 4 questions that were prepared ahead of time by B'nai B'rith Canada and provided to the campaigns in advance. Each of the candidates will have 3 minutes to give a main response to those questions, and then they'll each have a 1-minute reply to each other's response to those questions. After that portion of the debate ends, we'll be taking questions from the audience. And if you have a question, if you're an audience member and you have a question you'd like us to ask, you can just type it into the chat box and we will see it. I just remind the candidates not to answer those questions when they're typed into the chat box until I actually ask them. We welcome audience participation. We'd just like to remind everyone to be polite and try to ask questions as much as possible that are relevant to the federal Canadian sphere. So without further ado, I will introduce the two candidates we have with us tonight. On behalf of the Conservative Party of Canada, we have Melissa Lantsman, and she could just say hello. I guess everyone can hear her briefly. There she is, waving her hand. Very nice. And on behalf of the Liberal Party of Canada with us tonight, we have Mr. Gary Gladstone.
Shana Tova, welcome to all.
Thank you. So now we will proceed with the opening statements, and I have flipped a coin in advance to determine who will go first, and I will try my best to alternate throughout the evening when it comes to those things, and I will also be keeping time. What I will do actually for the benefit of the candidates is if you are approaching, when you approach the last 10 seconds of your allotted time for any given question or any given response, I will put up a big 10, just like this. Or 10 seconds remaining, and you should conclude. And hopefully I won't have to mute anyone tonight, but I don't think we will. So without further ado, the opening statement that we will be beginning with today will be from Mr. Gladstone.
Well, good evening. As you just heard, I'm Gary Gladstone, and it's important that we're at the B'nai Brith Canada debate, because what you may not realize, if it wouldn't be for B'nai Brith Canada, I wouldn't be where I am today. Back when you funded BBYO, I was proud to be active as a youth, moved on to Hilla, which I started on campus at Laurier in Waterloo, again, funded by B'nai Brith. And of course, I'm chartering president of Maven Lodge of B'nai Brith Canada, the highest per capita lodge when it was in existence. Friends, I am your neighbor. For 25 years, I've shared in your struggles, your successes, and your mitzvahs. To have helped our community grow and thrive. I am you, and I want to take our collective voice to Parliament Hill. I know that many of you watching this debate have already made up your minds about who you're voting for. Those of you who are supporting me, thanks. I'll do my best to continue to deserve your trust. Those of you who've decided to vote for another candidate, I hope that I'll be able to change your mind tonight. I only ask that you keep an open mind. But I really want to focus my remarks on those who haven't yet decided or who might still change their mind. Choosing who you want to represent you in Ottawa is not a decision to be taken lightly. Your vote is something to be cherished. When you cast that ballot, you want to be choosing someone who understands and shares your concerns and your priorities. I am that person. I'm your neighbor. What I am not is a lobbyist for big corporations. I'm not a political operative. I'm not a pundit. What I am is a community advocate. I've spent my life working on behalf of nonprofit organizations, including many, many Jewish groups, to help them get the resources they need to do their important work. I am a Jew and I am a liberal, and I am proud of both of those descriptions. The Liberal Party represents the values that Jews have held for millennia: compassion, community, kinship, and tikkun olam. I am your neighbor.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gladstone. And now an opening statement from Ms. Lantsman.
Well, thanks so much. And thanks to B'nai Brith for putting this debate together and for having me and for the work that you do to educate, expose, eradicate anti-Semitism. You have been a part of our community. I have been a part of your community, and I'm excited at the opportunity to be here tonight. I'm Melissa Lantsman, and I'm running to be Thornhill's next member. I'm asking for your support. And I think the job we have ahead is to defeat Justin Trudeau's government, who called an unnecessary election in the midst of a pandemic only 19 months after the last election, with no other reason than to secure a majority. And I think the responsibility for the next member of parliament from Thornhill is much greater for the future of our community than ever before, because the interests of our community are going to require someone who is going to say that I demand to be heard. And our community is going to have to fight harder because there are fewer Jews in parliament, there are fewer Jews in cabinet, and there are fewer Jews speaking up against the increasing surge of anti-Semitism, of hatred, and of delegitimization. For everyone on this call tonight, you know that every incident of anti-Semitic violence, no matter where it is, matters. It matters to how we set the rules in this country. It matters to how we fund basic security for our schools and our religious institutions. And it matters because an attack on freedom of religion, attack on Canada. And I want a government who will say it. Peter Kent has been the voice for this and for our community for 12 years, and he's supported us. And I'm honored to have his mentorship and his friendship and his tenacity as my #1 sign guy and his unconditional support of my candidacy. I've built organizations, I've run businesses. I'm an outspoken conservative who has given almost my entire adult life to ensuring that Canada is on the right side of history. And I'm very proud of that. And I'm someone who isn't afraid to stand up for our values. And if I'm elected, I will ensure that Thornhill has a strong voice nationally and the dedicated service that you deserve locally.
Thank you. And just before we move on to the prepared questions, there's 2 quick notes to the audience about audience questions that I should have mentioned. First is that if you would rather not put them in the chat box, I'm told you can also email them directly to b'naibrith.ca, and they will also reach me that way. And the second thing is just to make it a bit easier. Ideally, if the questions can be phrased in a way that they're open to both candidates and not a specific question to one candidate or the other, that'll just make it easier to administer. So moving along then, since we started with Gary for the opening statements, I think we'll start with Melissa for the prepared questions. So the first of which is, anti-Semitism in Canada is continuing to rise. The B'nai Brith Canada 2020 annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents showed an increase of 18.3% compared to 2019. This past May of 2021, B'nai Brith Canada reported an extremely disturbing surge of anti-Semitism stemming from the Hamas conflict, with more than 250 known incidents, including many assaults. What is your party's position on combating anti-Semitism? What will you do to ensure the safety of the Jewish community in your riding? And can you also speak to your party's position on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism? And this will be 3 minutes for each candidate, and then we'll get into the 1 minute responses.
Sure. So there is no question that there's been an alarming rise in anti-Semitism. I was recently part of a group of grassroots individuals that fundraised for 80 installations around the city's bus shelters. You might have seen them. They were denouncing Jew hatred. And over the last weeks, a number of those have been defaced with images of swastikas and anti-Zionist vandalism. And the same happened in our community, on a school, in parks. And make no mistake, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And in the largest Jewish community in Canada, our children have to face the Jew hatred in school, on university campuses, and in public just when they're walking. And I see the smattering of politicians, things like this has no place in Canada. But I want to remind you that actions speak louder than words. And the Liberals claim to support the definition of IHRA on anti-Semitism, and then immediately accepted a lady named Janica Atwin into their party after she egregiously violated that very definition with anti-Semitic comments, calling Israel an apartheid state. She called Israel an apartheid state 11 days before her welcome into the Liberal Party of Canada. So no wonder violent anti-Semitism is on the rise, because when you call Zionism the Jewish right to self-determination, a movement that is based in apartheid, in racism, or in genocide, what you are really doing is you are giving justification to the violent Jew hatred that exists out there. And when asked to clarify, she said that she stands by what she said. So here's what needs to happen immediately, and because another Liberal invitation-only summit to talk about anti-Semitism simply isn't going to work. We need to educate those in our institutions anti-Semitism. The police, Crown prosecutors, the judiciary need to know how to spot anti-Semitism in all of its different forms. And we keep leaving this issue to human rights commissions, and they've proven that they are unable to effectively stop it. So it has to be part of the rule of law. And on a more individual level, we need people to understand that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. The IHRA definition must be applied in holding those who propagate Jew hatred in all of its forms. And when Israel was under attack during the last round of indiscriminate rocket fire from Hamas terrorists, no one in cabinet, no one in the Liberal cabinet said anything. They were ordered not to. So when we needed friends, we actually didn't have any. So I would ask my opponent what he would have personally said to all of those members of his caucus who were silent. Would he too have been silent? What I would ask my opponent is why nobody has ever been prosecuted under that IHRA definition. And what I would ask my opponent is why was the most outspoken in government, why did he leave government to fight anti-Semitism on the outside of government?
Thank you. So now we'll have 3 minutes on this question from Mr. Gladstone.
Well, thank you very much. So I think number one, anti-Semitism and hatred and racism right now are on the rise, and it must stop. The summit that the Prime Minister held with chaired by my colleague and mentor and friend, Erwin Kotler, was absolutely wonderful in making sure that all voices were heard in terms of what needed to be done. And the Prime Minister's words at the end, which I will remind everybody right now, is that the Jewish community is not alone. He, Parliament, Liberal Party, and the country stand beside and with the Jewish community during the horrific times of the anti-Semitic acts, and appropriate actions are being taken. Last week, after Charlton Public School and after the defacing of number of colleagues both in Montreal and New York region, election signs with swastikas, I contacted Mayor Bevilacqua, York Regional Police, and we had very intense discussions about what was happening and what needed to be done. So the first thing I'm going to encourage all of your viewers, anytime anyone witnesses any anti-Semitic act whatsoever, please call number one is to your local police force. Up in York Region, we have an incredible force who takes great care of stuff. And the second call is to B'nai Brith Canada Anti-Hate Line. It's what B'nai Brith does absolutely best, always has, and always will continue to do so. What have I done? I have raised over the last decade 17 million for Jewish charities and nonprofits. A substantial amount of that has gone towards fighting anti-Semitism and hate. When Friends of Simon Wiesenthal wanted to launch their Tour for Humanity, education is always the cure. More education, Holocaust education. But when Wiesenthal wanted to launch their Tour for Humanity, their mobile classroom, they turned to me to raise the funds to launch it, which it had, and we've had a tremendous impact on schools across Ontario, and they're also traveling across the country. The Security Infrastructure Program, which I've written hundreds of thousands of dollars of grants for to various institutions, the Liberal government has quadrupled that to make sure that places of worship and community centers are safe. Bialik, Shar Shemayim in Montreal, Holy Blossom, number of Lubavitch institutions in the GTA. Those are some of those that I've been able to assist. Online hate speech needs to be fixed, and of course the Conservatives are nowhere there. When the Liberals released their platform yesterday, racism and anti-Semitism was mentioned. Of course, hatred, racism, and anti-Semitism, not a word anywhere in the Conservative platform. I should correct myself, racism and hatred were mentioned on anti-Semitism, but hatred against all. When I'm in a mosque with Islamophobia, I'm getting near the end. The IRA definition is where it needs to be. And thank God it was Liberal government under Justin Trudeau that had it there. And remember, this is not a partisan issue. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we can have a 1 minute response from Ms. Lantsman.
Sure, I would simply say that I know that my opponent is committed to anti-Semitism, but that wasn't my question. My question was, if you saw anti-Semitism within your own caucus, like we did with Janica Atwin, what would you have said? What would you have done? I would also ask, what would you have said to all of those caucus members, all of those members of cabinet who didn't say anything during the last round of hostilities? What would you have said to them? Would you too have been silent during that conflict? Why has nobody ever been prosecuted under IRA? And I want to know from my opponent what he thinks of his colleague leaving the government of Canada, our former MP in York Centre, Michael Levitt. Why did he leave the government of Canada to fight anti-Semitism on this side? I want to know if you think your voice will be heard, because it seems like you have an anti-Semitism problem in caucus.
Well, I will tell you first and foremost that the Prime Minister made it very clear again during the anti-Semitism conference and his statements afterwards, anti-Semitism has no place in the Liberal Party. Secondly, I'm really tired of your and the Conservative Party's divisiveness on Israel, where it's not a wedge issue. The Liberal Party is pro-Israel, Conservative Party is pro-Israel. That's wonderful. That's how it should be, and that's how it is. During the recent war, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, Mark Arnault, spoke unequivocally on Israel's right to defend itself. Two-state solution, reiterated time and time again. When acts of Semitism were there, despite the conservative machine going in drive saying nothing was said, the tweets are there, the Facebook messages are there, the press releases are there. You choose your narrative. I know the truth. Support for Israel is not a wedge issue.
Thank you to both the candidates. So now we'll move on to the second question, which will deal with a topic that I don't think anybody will be surprised is being raised today. COVID-19 is an issue that has affected every single Canadian over the past year and a half. And despite our progress, it is far from over in this country. What is your party's pandemic recovery plan? How will it help the most vulnerable people in our communities? And if elected, what will you personally do to ensure that your party's plan is successful? So since we're alternating, I'm now going to go to Mr. Gladstone first for 3 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. In terms of the vulnerable people, I'll start second last. This is something I understand because these are individuals that I work with nonstop. Many of you will know that I'm currently on leave as head of stakeholder relations for RENA, helping those with developmental disabilities. And I also do fundraising for the Kenora First Nations with the Kenora Chiefs Advisory. And the government took incredible care of vulnerable Canadians by getting vaccines out to them quickly. And the government of Ontario, through Premier Ford, I will commend him on the most part for being there as we needed it. In terms of Canada, we supported Canadians. We took immediate action to make sure that people could pay their bills, keep food on the table, and not have to worry about the decision of food on the table or paying rent. Businesses were able to stay alive with the CEWS, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. We finished the fight against COVID, rolling up their sleeves. We need to make sure everybody is getting vaccinated. Our numbers are now the envy of the world. But I have to tell you, the Conservatives are now playing politics with an important health issue. It doesn't make sense. They say they're against vaccine reports like Maxime Bernier and the PPC when it suits them. They kicked out a Yukon candidate, but then they want to pretend they're protecting the most vulnerable. The Thornhill residents deserve a straight answer. Will the Conservatives mandate vaccine passports so we can safely reopen our economy or not? Because it's up to us who can be vaccinated to get vaccinated to protect the vulnerable. I'm thrilled before the platform was released, Prime Minister allocated funds for vaccine passports, and Doug Ford has seen the light of day. He has changed his mind quite appropriately, and the passports are coming in, and that's where it needs to be. We have ordered all the third shots as appropriate. In terms of more vulnerable communities, the mental health supports, hiring 50,000 PSWs at $25 an hour, the GIS and OAS increases for seniors. That's what it's all about, the renovation credits, so seniors can age at home in place. These positive steps, generating jobs and helping people stay at home longer. Excuse me. And the move to make vaccines mandatory for the federal public service, planes, trains, interprovincial travel, again, to keep everybody safe. And where's the Conservatives on that? There's nowhere. Helping to hire a minimum of 7,500 family doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners to make sure that everyone has access to good and adequate primary health care. The elimination of the health system wait list. Again, the Prime Minister working closely with the Premier and Premiers across the country, in this case ours, and the virtual healthcare services, again, to the First Nations communities, absolutely vital. We'll go back to the Harper years when H1N1 came about. His first aid package to the First Nations communities were body bags. When COVID hit, no question, the First Nations were there with the vaccines. Thank you.
Okay, and now from Lantsman.
Sure. Look, I think the Trudeau government's painfully slow vaccine rollout allowed more dangerous and more transmissible, I should say, COVID variants to spread out of control in a third wave. And I think it resulted in punishing lockdowns and stay-at-home orders across the country. And I think hundreds of thousands of Canadians lost their job as a result, and suicide spiked, and opioid dependence has risen, and mental health that Canadians are experiencing in the silent pandemic. We're watching this government ignore that. And it's been 18 months and we keep doing the same thing. In fact, we're doing the same thing, but in an election. And I think Canada's recovery plan under Aaron O'Toole, under his leadership, has us coming out of this pandemic and getting back with our daily lives, with open borders, with a stockpile of PPE, with vaccines that we can depend on without the virtue signaling drivel that we're hearing in an election, nothing more than a desire for a majority. I think life is getting expensive because of Justin Trudeau, and it's only going to get worse. This quarter's GDP says so, rising inflation says so, and more spending on frivolous election promises says so. And we're experiencing a cost of living crisis. I think Conservatives have a plan to bring back down that cost of living, back to make sure that families are able to get ahead. We're going to tackle the housing crisis by addressing some of the concerns around increasing supply of rental housing, making it possible for your kids to live where they grew up, right here in Thornhill. We're going to build 1 million more new homes within the next 3 years by incentivizing developers to build the kind of housing we want and the kind of housing that we need. And more homes built near public transit that we're supporting right here in our community on a route that must be agreed to by that community. So we need to root out the corruption and the activities that drive those real estate prices up. We've got a plan to do that. On the jobs front, we're going to create 1 million jobs that we lost in this pandemic to support businesses with actual stimulus, not negative incentives that delay our recovery. And it's time for a government also to side with consumers. And we've got a plan to reduce how much Canadians pay for phones and internet by finally promoting competition. We're going to convert the childcare expense deduction into a refundable tax credit covering 75% of the cost of childcare for lower income families, which gives you the flexibility and the choice that you deserve right here in our community. In case you don't work from 9 to 5 and you can't find a spot in a 30-year-old promise of government-run daycare with no plans of making it happen. And finally, we're going to commit to trade policy that's with stronger ties to democratic allies. So we find ourselves in a crisis where we're relying on dictatorships.
Thank you. And so now back to a 1-minute reply from Mr. Gladstone.
Thank you very much. So once again, the Conservatives are going to make COVID a partisan issue. No, it is not. Safety for all. We are currently the envy of the, you want to call it the free world, the larger countries, the G7, what have you, in terms of the vaccine rollout. Virtual signaling drivel really helps no one. You mentioned all about those promises over 10 years. I've been in business a fair number of years, ran Canada's largest fashion jewelry wholesaler for a number, 10-year plans with unrealistic expectations of a 3% growth a year for 10 years. That just it's happened once in Canada. I'm not seeing it. The economy is growing. In terms of saving, I've been speaking with people in Thornhill at the doors who are telling me that their livelihood has been saved because of the supports that got out quickly where changes were made. I know I've been over time in the past. I'll stop now.
Thank you. And then we'll go to Ms. Lantsman.
We are certainly not in a position to pay for the promises. Canadians know, and I've spoken to people at the door, we don't even know why we're in election. We've seen a Liberal platform that is exactly the same of the budget that they just passed, with frivolous promises of things that we don't need with money that we don't have. We can't keep printing money. We are not going to get out of this. And if you don't see economic growth, check out yesterday. Our economy actually shrunk, and it's predicated on your growth projections that we're magically going to get out of this. We've got a 10-year plan to look at balancing our budget. I was in the crisis when we had it in 2008, and I think that I'll be a good voice in the room right now.
Thanks. So moving along to the third of prepared questions. Canada is a strong voice at the United Nations for tolerance and peace. However, at the same time, a strong anti-Israel bias permeates the United Nations and some of its agencies. Often, this anti-Israel bias morphs into blatant anti-Semitism. Just last month, a report found that dozens of teachers at UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, in their schools condoned violence and spread anti-Semitism online. Another report showed that UNRWA textbooks that deny Israel's existence and glorify terrorism. What steps will you take to ensure that no Canadian taxpayer dollars go towards United Nations programs or agencies like UNRWA that demonize Israel and Jews? And we'll begin with 3 minutes from Ms. Lantsman on this question.
Sure. We'll start with April of 2016, when Canada voted for a UN resolution on the support of Palestinians' right to self-determination. And it was 1 year after the Liberals came to power, and it was a play to win the UN Security Council seat. And it was the vote, the single vote marked the biggest departure from Canada's old voting record, which was never supported through the 14 years of consecutive votes during Stephen Harper's term since he came to power in 2006. And our government, our Canadian government, chose popularity at the UN rather than principle. And they chose to align with the despots and the dictators who held the balance of power of inviting Canada to those various hate fests. And we will reverse course on that. As conservatives, we will never single out Israel at the UN. In fact, we will look at all of our relationship with multilateral forums to determine what role Canada can play. And I was part of the Harper government when we ended the funding for UNRWA. So that Canadian tax dollars wouldn't fund the murder of innocent civilians. So in fact, I'm proud to have been part of a principled leadership on the world stage that we have lost over the last 6 years. And I think there isn't a single relationship that is better between Canada and any other country today than it was when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. Not one, not India, not China, not a single one. And the Liberals shamefully reinstated the UNRWA funding. And there was no oversight into how this money was being used to incite violence or terror. In fact, during the last round of fighting between Israel and Hamas, terror tunnels were discovered under UNRWA schools which are paid for in part by Canadian tax dollars. Our tax dollars used by terrorists seeking to destroy Israel as it rained rockets on innocent civilians. And if that's not enough, the last round of violence, the Liberals gave $25 million to organizations in Gaza without any investigation on whether or not that money would end up in the hands of Hamas. And so given the Liberal track record on this, I think Canadians should be very concerned about where our tax dollars are going. We will end that, full stop. And there is only one candidate in this debate that will ensure that that happens on the first day of a newly elected government. There's not a single mention of Israel in the Liberal platform, not once in almost 90 pages. So I'd like to know from my opponent, will he demand that his colleagues immediately put a stop to Canadian tax dollars being used to fund UNRWA or fund Jewish hatred? It's just a simple yes or no question.
Thank you. And I'll give him an opportunity to answer that question, or otherwise answer the question asked.
Thank you very much. So I guess the first question we have to think about is, would Israel be better off if Canada stepped away from the table, or having the oversight role that we have, we're in the position to do something? But before we get there, I'd just like to lay a couple of facts on the table. Number one, Stephen Harper was a good prime minister regarding issues relating to Israel. Harper and Peter Kent are both good friends to Israel and to the Jewish community. Harper strengthened Paul Martin's policies supporting Israel. Neither is perfect. Nobody is perfect. Not was or is as good a friend. Aaron O'Toole is no Stephen Harper. Aaron O'Toole is no Peter Kent. Justin Trudeau is a good prime minister regarding issues relating to Israel. The government he leads votes with Israel at the UN, and the voting record, according to the Library of Parliament, a nonpartisan, is far superior, because Harper had many abstentions that no one in the Conservative Party ever mentions. Trudeau was not perfect. Not every Liberal is as good a friend to Israel as Trudeau. But to be clear, I am a strong voice. I will be a strong voice, and it's incumbent upon the community to send another strong voice to be in the soon-to-be government of the Liberal Party to make sure that our voices are heard. The need for Canada to be at UNRWA comes through comes through Israel, because they need oversight, and it has proven effective, where during last report, a number of staffers were fired because it was found that they had put odious stuff, as we all know, within the the UN Watch allegation had 22 instances of social media violations, and 7 staff members were being investigated. The bottom line is, if UNRWA is not there, it's going to be left to Hamas and PA with absolutely no oversight whatsoever. And that's when you will see it going from not good to absolutely horrific. And the Israeli government has requested time after time that Canada stay there for those purposes. Canada's support to UNRWA is focused on education, healthcare, and social services, all of which contribute to improving the lives of Palestinian refugees and is also key for regional stability. The bottom line is, as every time I've been to Israel, the tour guides and the man on the street and the women on the street who know what's going on there, and of course we all know we can have much better conversations there, keep the bellies of the Palestinians full, give them a chance for a fulsome life, give them a chance for tomorrow, and that's when peace will happen, God willing, and that's when the wars will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. And now back over to Melissa for a 1-minute response.
So just to be clear, your answer is no, you will not advocate stopping the funding for UNRWA, despite knowing that Canadian tax dollars are going to killing Israeli civilians. On the first day of a newly elected government, there's going to be one person in this debate that stops that funding, that stops any additional funding, and that puts the checks and balances in place to know that Canadian tax dollars are not responsible for the death of innocent civilians. There's only one person in the debate that's going to do that.
A concise response. And now back over to Mr. Gladstone.
Well, I have to tell you, and I'll just reiterate once again, the oversight has been requested, and it's there for that very reason, to make sure that the 500,000 children and others that are being taught have some oversight, and it's not all left to Hamas and the PA, where, believe me, there will be more killings, there will be more death. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll move along to the fourth and final of the prepared questions before we get into the super exciting audience part. So this one will be going first to Gary for 3 minutes. As the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, Iran has supplied arms, personnel, training, and finances to various terrorist proxy groups in the Middle East and throughout the world. Much of its operations are conducted through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, which was also responsible for downing the Ukrainian passenger jet last year, resulting in many Canadian lives lost. The Islamic Republic has provoked and exacerbated conflicts that have resulted in casualties, displacement, and destruction of infrastructure. What is your party's view on Canada-Iran relations? Do you accept that the entirety of the IRGC should be designated a terrorist entity, as called for in a motion adopted by the House of Commons? And we'll begin with Mr. Gladstone.
Thank you very much. Well, about 2.5 years ago, I was honored to lead the Canada-Israel Inclusive Mission to Israel with Rena, March of Dimes, and Holland Bloorview. And when we went, we made sure that we took parliamentarians from both the Liberal and Conservative Party, because as everybody knows, when you touch the ground in Israel, you really know what's going on and what's happening. So on a day that was just for the parliamentarians that I had arranged with the former Consul General, Galit Baram, we arranged a briefing in Jerusalem and with the Foreign Ministry. And the Foreign Ministry's words were, don't worry about the PA, don't worry about Hamas. The only thing we are worried about is Iran, and they are our biggest threat, absolutely. So first, let's deal with some facts. The Liberal government did not restore diplomatic relationships with Iran. I support 100%. We've maintained a number of sanctions targeting the Iranian regime, including arms embargoes, import and export restrictions, targeted asset freeze, and financial prohibitions. Flight PS 752 tragedy caused by the shooting down of the airplane by Iran. Focus of the Liberal government has been squarely on seeking justice and accountability. Let's nail them where it hurts. On the IRGC being named a terrorist entity, Prime Minister, along with the rest of Parliament, has voted in favor. I support 100%. They are a terrorist entity. I am glad that they are named as such, and they have to be dealt with as such. No ifs, and thank you.
Thank you. Now over to Melissa.
See, the problem is that they're not named as such, and it was a conservative motion in 2018 where the House adopted calling for the IRGC to be designated as a terrorist organization. And the Revolutionary Guard has long been a tool of repression and violence in Iran across the world, which is why the Conservative Party brought forward the successful vote, brought forward the motion that led to the successful vote in June of 2018 to have them listed. And I'll reiterate the motion. It was the Conservative opposition once again called on the Trudeau government to finally list the IRGC as a terrorist after 18 months of foot dragging. And the Liberals had voted for the measure and yet have done nothing to recognize the destructive and destabilizing influence of the Revolutionary Guard. And it should be designated a terrorist entity. It's long overdue, and their foundational principles are completely irrelevant with the protection of human rights, of democracy, of the rule of law, and their impact on Iran and the broader Middle East, and the continued prosecution of, or persecution, I should say, of Iranians here in our community. Those living right here in Thornhill are amongst the most egregious threats, I think, in every day, in every value that Canadians hold dear. And I think the shooting down of Ukrainian flight PSW 752 was a deliberate act of terrorism committed by the Revolutionary Guard, and they must be held to account. And we know this, and the evidence is clear. And if Conservatives form government, we will not forget those who perished to ensure those perpetrators are brought to justice. And that includes identifying who it was, applying the sanctions necessary, and where possible, arrest them and put them on trial. We owe it to these victims. I've spoken to these victims. Some of them live in our community. We owe it to these families living right here in our community to compensate them. And the lack of action speaks volumes. And the promotion of religious fanaticism by the regime and the fundamentalism, I think, presents one of the greatest threats to global security. So my question to my opponent is, what day will you list the IRGC as terrorists in this country? Because you can't say that it's a threat in September of 2021 in the middle of an election and have the opportunity to have done something since 2018. It isn't surprising from a government, I think, whose Minister of Women just called the Taliban, after they retook Kabul, our brothers, just less than a week ago. So I'm asking a simple question. What day will the IRGC be listed?
Thank you. Over to Mr. Gladstone for a response.
Well, Aidan, I would tell you that this is one more case where we both agree that the IGRC is a terrorist entity and shall be named and will be named. And in terms of the Iranians living here in the riding, which is a growing population, which we're delighted to have here, absolutely, they have relatives back home, and I hear on a regular basis that the life that they have there because of the regime, which are not supported by the individuals, what's happening with them and how can we help them? And we've been able to get some relief. We've been able to get some supplies. We're about to provide some vaccines, my understanding, to the individuals on the ground through the Red Cross, because that's what Canada does. And in terms of the names nomenclature, I have to tell you, Minister Monsef apologized, but being from Afghanistan, that's how she talks, brothers and sisters. And I'm sure you've been to more than one mosque and know that's how people are referred to. Anyways, thank you.
Okay, and back over to Melissa for 1 minute.
Sure. It's very simple. The victims of flight PS5 have asked for one thing from the government, and that's compensation, and they haven't gotten it, and they will tell you loud and clear. And they want a government who will be unequivocal about the Iranian threat and the threat that it poses to Iranians living here in Canada. So I'd ask them on the very first day of a newly elected government, who is going to be the voice that lists them as a terrorist organization, because it's long overdue, and you promised to do it.
Thanks. So now we move on to many audience members' favorite part of this debate, which is audience questions that have been posted. We've seen a lot of great ones coming in, and actually one of the advantages of this format is that the candidates have seen some of them coming in, and I think have addressed some of them in their previous responses as a result of that. So obviously we're not going to get to all of them. I will try to find a good one on a topic we haven't dealt with so much yet. And I think I've found one. And we'll do the same format, 3 minutes or up to 3 minutes. It doesn't have to be 3 minutes for each candidate, and then up to a minute each for response. So the first one is scenes from last month's collapse of Afghanistan after decades of Canadian and Western efforts there have horrified many across this country. Nowhere are the effects more deeply felt than among Canada's Afghan community and Canadian servicemen and women who served in Afghanistan. Now that the formal evacuation from Kabul airport is over, what can and should Canada do to help Canadian citizens remaining in Afghanistan and Afghans who assisted Canadian forces and now face reprisals from the Taliban? And so we'll start up to 3 minutes from Ms. Lantsman.
Sure. Look, I'll start with saying that I've been to Afghanistan, and I've actually been there twice. And I think that this one is going to be a stain on our country's history, because it's very easy to understand that you could have gotten more people out. 158 of our soldiers perished in Afghanistan throughout our active combat mission. I was one of the people in Ottawa who used to get the calls in the morning. I think this government has failed those who stood by those 158 and all of those who served in Afghanistan. And I think, again, it's very easy for Canadians to understand that we could have done more and that we should have done more. And that any other government, rather than knocking on doors in the middle of an election, should have gone back to Ottawa and done every single thing possible. And we could support those that we brought here, and we could have brought more. And I think that we should support those who other countries, of countries who have way less resources than us had brought out to Afghanistan. We should be there on the front line, welcoming them and figuring out how to get them here, because throughout the conflict, they helped us and we were nowhere to be found. Instead, we had a minister who called the Taliban our brothers. And I think Canadians won't forget that, and they will never forget this mission.
Thank you. Now over to Mr. Gladstone.
Well, I think it's good to recall that in 2014, the Conservatives left Afghanistan militarily. So when it was time to start the airlift, we were starting from scratch with no one on the ground, no one there, and we were able to go in, get out people when everyone was saying it would take 6 to 8 months for the Taliban to take over Kabul in the airport. And then we knew it was moving faster from our own sources. We upped our game considerably, and no one expected the fall to be that quick, nobody. And we have done everything, and we will continue to do, including our wonderful allies, helping us help them, and them helping us to get out those who stood beside Canada. Yes, they will be rescued. Increased number of Afghan refugees coming in to Canada, much like a number of years ago, not quite the same circumstances, obviously, but the Syrian refugees, where there was a crisis, there was a problem. Personally speaking, my family and I got together with friends and associates and raised enough funds to bring 7 Syrian refugees over, get them settled in Toronto. As soon as one landed, she gave birth. All counted as we rescued 8. They're now incredibly functioning members of Canadian society, jobs, etc. But that doesn't discount the fact that Canada is still working behind the scenes, in front of the scenes. Ministers are still taking care of their ministerial duties and getting people out. Our armed forces are the best, and they are working around the clock to get people out as quickly as possible. Just because the US is left doesn't mean that we're leaving everyone, and more people will be coming out.
Thank you. And if there's desire for one, we can have up to a 1-minute response from Ms. Lantsman.
I would just say that's just simply untrue. You didn't start from scratch, and it's an insult to our Canadian forces. We have bases all over the world, and there are countries with a lot less in terms of resources and a lot less in terms of military capability that have got more people out. And I know that you think that ministers are working, but ministers are actually knocking on doors in their ridings in what is an unnecessary election during a crisis, not only a COVID crisis, but one in Afghanistan that cost 158 lives, and a government that simply just was missing in action when the people that helped us there needed it most.
Thank you. And response, Mr. Gladstone?
The election is here because Canadians deserve to choose the method out of the pandemic now that we're at the stage that we can make decisions and move forward. Moving forward together for everyone is the way I see things, as are all the people on the doors that I'm knocking at. They're not interested in the cuts for the Conservatives to balance the budget tomorrow, which is an impossibility over the biggest global catastrophe since the war. So no issues with me by the election. It's being handled safely. Elections Canada has been working since COVID began as a minority government to ensure safety, and we have no issues. Thank you.
Thanks. We've had a number of questions already in this debate about foreign policy and Canada's place in the world. So I think this next question is particularly apt. Someone from the audience points out that actually under both the previous Liberal government and the Conservative government before it, Canada tried but failed to win a seat on the UN Security Council. So what are the candidates or parties' plans to increase Canada's stature internationally so that it can better capitalize on what the parties want to do? And we'll start with Mr. Gladstone.
Well, just before we start, Aidan, I'm not sure if it was your end or my end, but I didn't hear the entire question. So if it's not a problem to repeat it, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So we have a question from the audience pointing out that under both the current Liberal government and the previous Conservative government, Canada tried but failed to win a UN Security Council seat. So that being the case, what would the candidates or parties do to try to increase Canada's stature internationally so that we can capitalize on some of the points that both of you have been talking about?
Well, thank you. Well, when I was young and in my prime and doing some traveling, I was thrilled to have a Canadian flag on my backpack. Canada was well respected. Canadians were well respected. Everything was absolutely wonderful. Harper came to power. All of a sudden, that seemed to go away. Canada was not on the world stage. Canada was not around. Canadians were not welcomed overseas to the greatest extent that they were. And Trudeau's comments were back on the world stage when he took over. I agreed. I was there, and that's where we should be. In terms of being involved with the UN, listen, they're not perfect. It's not an issue. But I'll go back to being there for the oversight as opposed to not being there at all. We are listened to. Bob Ray as our ambassador and raconteur, Erwin Kotler having the special status with anti-Semitism. The representatives from Canada are listened to. The oversight is there, and it's important that we always play a part in world affairs in a major way.
Thank you. And over to Melissa.
I'll start with when I was in my prime, I was sitting in 2010 behind the foreign minister when we lost the UN Security Council bid. And the difference is that we made the tough decisions and took the principled positions. The difference between our government and Trudeau's is that we didn't trade away our principles to gain a seat at the table. We stood with our allies even when it wasn't convenient, and we stuck to our principles even though it was hard. And I believe that Canada needs to pursue more bilateral relationship with our allies, with other democracies, because Canada's support for Israel and Canada's support for what is right, regardless of the popularity, needs to remain steadfast. And if that can't happen in the UN, then we need to look at all of the multilateral forum that we are a part of. Look, I think the key to moving forward is expanding trade relationships with people that share our values. I think it's sending open skies. And I think that the notion that it was never popular to travel with a Canada flag on your backpack when anybody prime minister is nonsense. There is not a single country where our relationship is better today than it was 6 years ago. Not a single one. You had a costume party in India. You have a terrible relationship where he's holding two of our Canadians hostage in China. A government that's unable to say that there is a genocide being committed by the government of Canada. There is not a single relationship that is better. There is not a single country that respects us more today than they did 6 years ago.
Thank you. And if Mr. Gladstone would like to respond, do so for up to a minute.
That's fine.
No response? Okay, so we'll move on to the next question then. So another member of the audience notes that reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada is an increasingly important issue right now. And I think also that many people in the Canadian Jewish community in particular feel close to this issue because we were denied access for a long period of time to our own Indigenous homeland. So the question is, do you believe the federal government should continue to fight Indigenous people who are suing before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal over abuse that they suffered as children? And more broadly, what would your party do to advance reconciliation in Canada? And this time we'll go first to Ms. Lantsman.
Sure. So look, I think the discovery of mass graves over the course of the last year has been heartbreaking, and I think that we need to do more than what I call virtue signaling, whether it's changing your screen to orange or putting shoes out, that we actually need to act. And for the first time, I think that you see a very clearly laid out plan from Conservatives. I think the Conservative Party supports treaty rights and the process of reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous people. And we acknowledge that there is a deep sorrow, but we've got to do more than that. There are still communities in this country that don't have clean drinking water. And we've committed to taking action on that. It's not enough to take a knee. It's not enough to change your Facebook banner. You've got to do something. We've got a swift timeline to reconciliation calls to action through 71 through 76. Those are involving the missing children and providing healing for those families. And I think it's important that we get this right. And I think it's important that we're not suing them while telling them that that they're important. This is something that the country has to reckon with, but it's something that the country has to reckon with actual action and not just words.
Thank you. Over to Mr. Gladstone.
Well, this is something that I take very personally, 100%. You may be aware, I think I mentioned it earlier, that I'm blessed to be in charge of fundraising for the Kenora Chiefs Advisory. 9 First Nations communities in and around Kenora, raised $1 million for them last year. I've had the opportunity to be up in communities, often spoken with the chiefs, and they are thrilled. Although not all drinking water is safe, the progress that has been made under the Trudeau government to lift drinking water boil water advisories is unprecedented. The Kelowna Accord that was going to come in under Paul Martin until Harper came in and destroyed it. Now at least we're back on footing. The graves from the residential schools is abominable, and supports have been there, and we're providing, Liberal government is providing more to locate more and to provide the appropriate mental health supports as and when they're needed. We're also working with First Nations communities on their child welfare system so they can be taken care of their own much better. We as Jews, back to your point, Aidan, or the question, yes, we do have more of an interest. We do have more of a desire. And I can tell you that there are many, many philanthropists within the Jewish community who have been helping me and who have been helping our friends in First Nations across the land, obviously, not just Kenora, to improve their lives. Resiliency is where they're at. The First Nations communities also look to the Jewish community for guidance, because it's the Jewish community who, after the Holocaust, have been able to rebuild, whose language was destroyed, whose culture in Europe was destroyed, who we were able to bring it back. The First Nations are turning to us and looking at us as to how to bring, and the relationships between the two entities have only been improving lately, which once again is where it needs to be. In terms of reconciliation with the First Nations, last time I checked, that was under the Liberal government. Nothing happened under Harper. And it's important that we work together. Mistakes, unbelievable errors. I can't believe that in my lifetime, we had the 60s scoop, where we thought it was wise to go take people out of their homes, remove their culture, remove their language, remove everything that made them human. And governments of all sizes, of all stripes, at all levels, and the Catholic Church and many others were complicit in all of this. We need to do everything we can to set things right.
Okay. And time for response from Ms. Lantsman, if she likes.
Sure, and I think that the words are nice, but there's a couple things that won't change this, and a photo op won't change the fact that Indigenous people don't have clean drinking water, and we've got to end the boil water advisories. A national holiday won't change the economic opportunities and support for education that this government has talked a big game about and hasn't delivered on. It's not going to change the lack of business or access to government procurement. It's not going to fix the lack of mental health supports on these reserve. And I think that you need a government that's not only going to talk the talk, but walk the walk. And that's exactly what's in our plan.
Thanks. And back over to Gary.
So first of all, Melissa, please stop trying to make everything a wedge issue. Secondly, I'd be interested to know how many boil water advisories and how much money did Harper invest in First Nations communities when he was Prime Minister. I'd also like you to acknowledge that the CTV News report at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, which showed the supplies that were sent up during H1N1 to First Nations were body bags on the first plane, as opposed to how the Trudeau government assisted First Nations communities to get through the pandemic with minimal loss. And it could have been a lot worse based on living conditions. We've also been investing billions in housing on the First Nations communities, which I'm aware of because I've completed those grants for many organizations. And the platform has listed another $2 billion in an Indigenous housing strategy built with Indigenous partners sitting together, not dictating. Thank you.
Thanks. Moving on to the next audience question. We spoke earlier about anti-Semitism in general as an issue in Canada, but a big part of that problem, and not just anti-Semitism, other forms of racism and hate as well, is online anti-Semitism, hate propaganda, conspiracy theories, which are really just getting out of control to the point where you can't go on social media anymore as a Canadian almost and not encounter these things, whether you want to or not. So the question is, what do either of the parties intend to do in order to combat the flood of anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred online? And for this one, we'll start with Mr. Gladstone.
Well, thank you. Well, online hate, you've hit the nail on the head. That's where you've got to start. And it's not only, as again you've mentioned, it's not only anti-Semitism, it's Islamophobia, it's anti-Asian racism, it's Black racism, it's Indigenous racism, it's hatred of any sort. And we need to have the proper legislation in place to ensure that hate speech to that degree is addressed. Laws are targeted towards online hate, and that those can be charged and convicted because they are a menace to society and they are inciting and increasing hatred.
Thank you. Over to Melissa.
Finally, a point of agreement. I do believe there should be legislation, but there is a big problem, is we don't know how to eradicate something if we don't know what we're looking for. And I know that there's many people on this call tonight who have probably called a hate hotline for anti-Semitism that they've seen or that they felt, or anti-Zionism that they've seen and felt, which is effectively the same thing. And you have the other person on the line saying, I don't get it. I don't get why that's Jew hatred. And so I think it needs to start with a massive re-education of what we are looking for in order to eradicate it, because you can't expose something until you educate people about it. And I think that for a long time, our human rights councils just haven't done that. The IRA definition has never been applied. Nobody has ever been prosecuted. So we can't just start with a hotline to an Ottawa bureaucrat about what's hateful online. There is a lot of work to do to educate the judiciary, law enforcement, the courts on what they are actually looking for, because I think that's the crux of the problem. It's not a community that doesn't know what it's looking for. It's the fact that nobody else does.
Thank you. And Mr. Gladstone can have a response up to a minute if he likes.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I would just like to reiterate my opening comments when we were discussing it. Education is key. It is vitally important, and that is the way to stop and curb, is to shine light on the darkness of the hatred, and that is what is important. education, educating all. And that's what I've always helped communities with and will continue to do so. And speaking with others at all the organizations I've worked for, and when speaking with the mayor and police recently after the recent incidents, we all agree on educate, report, and monitor. Thank you.
Thank you. And we can go back to Melissa for a response.
Sure. I'd like to see a government that's going to say that anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I'd like to hear my opponent say that. I'd like to hear my opponent talk about what he would do when Jenica Atwin was invited into his caucus, because that is, that is action louder than words. 11 days before you invited her into the Liberal Party, she called Israel an apartheid state. I'm going to remind people as many times as possible, because I still haven't heard you denounce her and you tell everybody on this call what you would have done. Would you have sat next to her in caucus? Are you going to sit next to her in caucus? Because it was only 11 days before you had the welcome party.
Thank you. So moving on to another audience question. The Canadian Armed Forces have faced, and some of its high-ranking members have faced some serious allegations over the past year of sexual harassment, other forms of harassment, which has created a crisis of confidence in terms of the public's perception of the armed forces, and I'm sure hasn't been good for the internal morale of the armed forces either. So the question is, what are the candidates or the party's plans to ensure that in the Canadian Armed Forces, and I think in government and in law enforcement more generally, what are we doing to ensure that this sort of harassment is a thing of the past, that women don't have to experience anymore? And for this question, we'll start with Melissa.
Sure. This isn't a thing of the past. It's not a thing of the past in politics. You have a candidate in the Liberal Party who's been accused 4 times, where one of his staffers actually tried to take their own life, running right here in Kitchener, not denounced by the Prime Minister. There is no mechanism in politics, clearly not one that works, clearly not one where the Prime Minister's office, other staffers have some mechanism to complain. And I want to bring this to the forefront because there are lots of women who want to run for office. There are lots of women who want to work in Ottawa. And if you hear more stories of staffers wanting to kill themselves because they blew a whistle and nobody in the Prime Minister's office answered, then I think we have a big problem. I think we have that same problem in the Canadian Forces, and it's been true. And it's about who knew what when. And if Canadians don't have the confidence that they can raise their voice when this happens, then they're never going to have the confidence that our institutions, our government, the top levels of our Prime Minister's office will ever listen to those who face sexual harassment. Every workplace should be a safe workplace, and we should expect more from our politicians.
Thank you. And now over to Mr. Gladstone.
Every workplace must be a safe workplace. Every workplace must be safe from harassment, whether it's from gender, whether it's from sexuality, whether it's from race, whether it's from ethnicity. Everybody must be safe everywhere at all times, no ifs, ands, or buts. We need the facts, not innuendo. In terms of the current MP under investigation, that's exactly right. He's under investigation, and we will deal with that as appropriate. There have been many MPs from the Liberal caucus who have been, well, I shouldn't say many, that's an incorrect statement. Some that have been found to have violated, have been kicked out of caucus, quite appropriately. This is something that I have never stood for, nor will I ever stand for.
Thank you. And we can have a response up to 1 minute from Melissa, if she likes.
I would simply just ask, how many times is 4 times enough for somebody to complain about sexual harassment? Is a suicide attempt enough to complain about sexual harassment for the Prime Minister's office, his staff, and his fellow caucus members and candidates to denounce that kind of behavior and kick him out as an MP who is running for office, who is running to hold public trust, who is running to show girls and women that they too can run and they too can work in an environment? How many times is enough times for the Liberal Party of Canada to say no thanks? Because it's not 4, it's more.
Okay, back over to Mr. Gladstone if he'd like to respond.
I'll just reiterate that the investigation is ongoing right now, and the results will be known soon and will be dealt with accordingly.
Thank you. And it was pointed out to me, and this is an important thing given the question you're talking about, that I have to be consistent in whether I'm referring to candidates by their first name or their last name. So I will try to be more consistent and fair in that going forward.
As long as you don't call me late for dinner, it's not a problem.
I won't do that. Okay, another question on something that is somewhat of a provincial issue, but there is a federal aspect to it as well, getting back to anti-Semitism. Which is that people who are members of the Jewish community in my age or younger will certainly know that one of the hotbeds of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, are many colleges and universities in Canada, and those are under provincial jurisdiction, but they do receive certain funding from the federal government. Ottawa does have some amount of influence over them. So the question is, what will you or your parties do to combat the rampant anti-Semitism that so many Jewish students face every day in Canada? And on that one, we'll start with Gary. Oh, I think we may have a connection issue. I think Gary may have
Thank you. So first of all, it should be noted that, yeah, can you hear me okay? Okay, so it should be noted that Prime Minister Trudeau, a graduate of McGill, well before he was Prime Minister, were having some serious issues with BDS and anti-Semitism. And it was the Prime Minister at the time, Justin Trudeau, he may have been at the time, I'm sorry, my memory lapses, but spoke out very strongly on social media and in person with the microphone to denounce BDS, which he has continued to do throughout all the campaigns anytime it has been brought up. It's also under the Liberal government that the BDS resolution was passed. And again, that's vitally important that everybody knows where government stands. Working with universities at all levels and supporting the youth through, again, the anti-racism programs, and by supporting the incredible work of many of the organizations who, as we know, I have worked for, be it CEJA, B'nai Brith, Wiesenthal, etc., to help the youth on campus with the tools that they need. I experienced it firsthand when I was at Waterloo, well, first Laureate, then Waterloo back in the early 80s. We didn't have the campus clubs. We didn't have a Hillel. We didn't have a Chabad on campus until I started them, because that's where the PLO at the time was sending their speakers over to the first university. And I'm sure there's some people on the line who remember being with me at Network, North American Jewish Students and Young Adults, learning from the professionals what to do, how to engage. And that's what it's all about. And we have some of the finest organizations now with lots of money from all places to assist and teach and learn and look and solve the problems from all levels. The universities now are more on side at the administrative level than they have been, but more needs to be done and will continue to be done.
Thank you. And now over to Melissa.
I think we have a free speech problem on campus, and nowhere is that more clear than when students are choosing their universities based on where they would feel safest as a Jewish student today. This was prevalent when I was on a university campus. I was active in all kinds of student initiatives to make sure the campus was a safer place. And there was a lot of organizations that exist, but the problem lies not only at the administration level, but at the tenured professor level. And we've got levers in the federal government. I think universities and universities and colleges, whatever that looks like now in Ontario, in terms of ministerial responsibility, I think it's the fourth or fifth largest spend in the province, maybe fifth after the debt repayment. But we've got levers from the federal government to demand better from universities, to demand safe spaces on campus for Jews. You don't have to, you know this particularly well as somebody who is either in a conservative club, in a pro-Israel club. We've got to get to universities to recognize what we all recognize on the outside in politics, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And I want to hear universities say it, and I want to hear governments say it, and withhold funding until.
Thank you. And now back over to Gary for a response up to 1 minute, if you'd like.
You know, I'm a little bit confused about my opponent, who says on the one hand that she's been in corridors of power and the federal government has levers, and she was in Harper's office when those levers were needed. And I know it's the fact that anti-Semitism on campuses has gone for much longer than 6 years. But even if not, as the fourth or fifth largest from the Ontario budget, Melissa, you ran the Premier's War Room when he got elected. You were with Premier Ford for quite some time afterwards, and yet nothing happened there. You were in the rooms with power that you always say you were in, and this is one other instance where you were not able to utilize those powerful places where you claim to have been with the work that you claim to have done.
And Melissa, if you'd like to respond to that.
Sure, I didn't claim to be there. I was there, and I was proud to be part of a government that was actually principled. And for a long time, I know that sometimes allies will come to your parties and they'll come to your events and they'll give money to your fundraiser. But when the doors close, decisions are made outside of staffers. And this is exactly why I put my name on the ballot, because sometimes in those rooms of power, if your name is on the ballot, and you should know this because you've put your name on the ballot before, you've put your name on the ballot in this riding, you've put your name on the ballot in another riding, you've wanted to put your name on a ballot in a third riding, you know that unless your name is on a ballot, you don't have the ability to make those decisions. And that's exactly what I'm doing today. So I look at the people on this call and they should ask themselves, which one of us is going to demand to be heard? Which one of us is going to push for the changes that we are talking about today? Because I think the answer is clear.
Thank you. So we had a member of the audience who states, and I will take a position on this, that both Mr. Trudeau and Mr. O'Toole are broadly in favor of oil pipelines. And obviously oil and fossil fuels are an important part of the economy in Canada, but at the same time, extracting them contributes to climate change and global warming. And we've been seeing more and more sort of severe weather situations in various parts of the world recently. So the question to the candidates is, what will your party do if it reaches power in order to balance resource extraction as part of the Canadian economy and the need to fight climate change? And we'll start with Ms. Lantsman.
Sure. Look, I think that you can't ignore the reality of climate change. I certainly don't. It's already affecting our ecosystem. It's hurting our communities, and it's damaging infrastructure. And I think you just need to watch the news to see that fires and floods are definitely a thing. Conservatives, I think, will meet our Paris climate targets, our Paris climate commitments, I should say, reduce emissions by 2030, but without the government taxing hardworking Canadians that deliver the jobs and the investment necessary out of our country. And instead, I think, of sending your money to Ottawa's slush funds, where they just spend it on general revenues to the tune of $400 billion just this year, and another $70 billion in a platform after a budget that they've just passed, will introduce a low carbon savings account where it helps Canadians make those greener lifestyle choices while allowing them to decide what works best for them and their families. In terms of resource extraction, this is a prime minister that has ignored the West. This is a prime minister that has ignored Alberta. This is a prime minister that has ignored the plight of Albertans who depend on those jobs. We do to market. We're sitting on a ton of resources. We've got enough resources in this country to make ourselves energy independent. We've got enough green technology in this country to not depend on regimes like Saudi Arabia for our gas. And I think there's only one person running for prime minister who's going to respect the West and respect the jobs that could be created there after a year like no other.
Thank you. Now over to Mr. Gladstone.
Well, when we're discussing climate emergency, Melissa, I'm thrilled to know that you do believe there is a climate emergency, because well over 50% of conservatives don't believe that there is, including your good friend Jason Kenney, who is conservative, Alberta. Enough said. The liberal path is using clean tech, green tech, rebuild the economy, rebuild a million jobs, and make sure that Canada is a world leader in green technology. And that is what we'll be doing under the Liberal government, who, God willing, is reelected September 20th. The Liberals are the only pro-climate change party, period, end of story. We've got the plan to move forward. We've got the plan that works. And we, anyone interested in climate, particularly in the Thornhill area, thank you very much. They know which party has the right way and is moving forward.
Thank you. And yeah, back to Ms. Lantsman for a response, if she likes.
Sure. I think once again, the Liberals have failed to recognize the massive contributions that the energy sector and the workers make to our country, and they will continue to do that. And I think, unlike Justin Trudeau, who wants to phase out the sector and its jobs entirely, there is a balanced approach. And to say that that there is only one party that that is in favor of doing anything about climate change, well, I just think that's not true.
Thanks. And then back to Mr. Gladstone.
I'll just tell you that my Mishpucha in Calgary, some of whom work in the oil industry, do good stuff, and they are now looking at ways and are changing their ways in order, again, clean tech and green tech, and they're investing and building nicely themselves, not with government assistance.
Thank you. And as we get closer to the end of the audience questions in tonight's debate, I actually have a very interesting question that it's a bit different from the other ones. So member of the audience says, and I think he is correct, that the recent polls tend to show a minority situation in regards to which party is in the lead. Obviously that could change, but that seems to be what the polls are showing right now. So the question is, if your party wins the most seats, but not a majority, do you intend, or do you understand that your party intends to try to govern as a minority, or are you open to forming a coalition with the NDP or the Bloc Québécois? And we'll start with Mr. Gladstone on that one.
Thank you. So first of all, elections matter, polls matter. However, we all know that the polls do not foresee the future. I will tell you that in 2010, when I was involved in the Toronto mayoralty race, poll after poll, you would not have expected the late Rob Ford to have been mayor of Toronto. You would not have expected Mayor Nenshi to have won in Calgary, Donald Trump in his first win. So there's only one real poll that counts, and that's on September 20th. And I would encourage everybody to vote. Obviously, I hope you're supporting me and the Liberal Party if you're outside Thornhill. But the bottom line is, come September 20th, you need to get out there and vote to make sure that your vote counts. In terms of governing as minority, we have before, and we'll do it again for the betterment of the country. And we'll figure out what will make the most sense and move forward, because moving forward together for everyone to make sure that no one is left behind as we come out of the pandemic is what this election is about, and what we will ensure is the case. Thank you.
Thank you. And now over to Ms. Lantsman.
Look, I think the vote matters, and I think that any outcome of that vote has to respect what the electorate wants. So governing in a coalition, as much as you hear no one say it, that is absolutely the plan of the Liberals, the Green, the NDP, and the Bloc Québécois. The only problem is that they just had a minority. We just had an election 19 months ago, and the Liberals have proven that they are unable to govern in a minority. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in an election right now. So I think that it's important to respect the will of the voters. And if that conservative minority comes, or if that conservative, better yet, if that conservative majority comes, where I think that people are waking up to punishing this government for calling an unnecessary election in a pandemic with no new plans, 19 months after they couldn't work with an opposition that gave them everything they wanted anyway, I think Canadians will look at that and wonder why. And you're absolutely right. The only poll that matters is election day, but there's something called momentum in a campaign. And right now it is not with the Liberals. So I'm looking forward to being part of a strong, national, stable, conservative majority government. And I'm looking forward to have a seat at the table for everything we discussed today and more.
Thank you. And Mr. Gladstone can certainly respond if he likes.
No, that's fine.
No response. Okay, so I think we'll have time for, I'll sneak in one last question. We dealt with that one pretty quickly, which is a member of the audience is pointing out that in Canada and in some other Western countries, in the past few months, there's been some inflation creeping into the economy, likely as a result of, governments understandably spending more during the pandemic. So the question is, what will your party do to balance spending to support Canadians who are still struggling with COVID and the aftermath of COVID, with the need not to let inflation get out of control? And we'll start with Melissa for the final question.
Sure. So look, over the course of the pandemic, we've seen Canadians lose their job. We've seen women accounting for more than half of the year-over-year unemployment losses, which should be concerning. And we've got a plan to get Canada's recovery back on track. And we've got a plan to balance that budget, or at least return to a path to balance in the next 10 years. The reason that we're seeing inflationary pressures, the reason that we're seeing an economy not started, is because we've continued to hand out supports to perhaps people who don't need them. So we've got to have a compassionate wind down. I've talked to so many business owners over the course of this election and well before that cannot find people to work. They cannot find people to come in, and that means goods aren't delivered on time. Product is wasted. You only have to sit in a restaurant to understand that you're going to have to wait an hour and a half because they can't find staff. So at this point, we're at a negative incentive, and we're not doing the things that are necessary to stimulate the economy. We've seen, it's 3 weeks into an election. We saw a plan from the Liberals yesterday that had nothing new in terms of how to kickstart our economy. So inflation, a lack of GDP growth, this is all going to make a difference on us spending money we don't have on things that we don't need, and we can't sustain it forever.
Thank you. And now over to Gary.
Well, this election, we need to decide what we want our future to look like for our kids and our grandkids. Fighting climate change to creating jobs, the Liberal team has a plan to move forward for everyone, especially Thornhill. We've got a housing plan, a home for everyone, to help reaching the dream of owning a home and joining the middle class. Most importantly, I want my kids to be able to get out of the house at some point, and the new plan shows a good way forward. Plan to create jobs, fight climate change, invest in healthcare, and make life more affordable for families with $10 a day childcare, which is essential to get the labor force back to where it is. We have a plan to create new jobs, accelerate climate action for cleaner communities and less pollution. And we all know it starts with the plan to finish COVID, which is what we're all about. And I much prefer going forward with everyone than the Tories and the cuts that will come with less supports for everyone. I know from speaking with people at the doors of people whose lives are now at a stable place because of CERB, because of queues. The Jewish day schools have been able to stay open because of queues, even though there were some minor hiccups in it. I was able to work with government, with many others, to get that straightened out so they could stay open. Dentists are telling me that it's only with queues and CERB that they're still around. In terms of the economic plan, I'm pleased with what's been presented in the Liberal platform at the liberal.ca/our platform. And I'd encourage everybody to have a look and see what the facts are. Thank you.
Thank you. And Melissa, you can respond for up to a minute if you'd like.
I say that we see what we see and we know what we know, and the emergency spending response to was just the beginning of what the Liberals have in store, and we simply can't afford it. Musing about a home equity tax or a capital gains tax at 15 or 25% is going to put families in Thornhill under. When the majority of your equity and the majority of your savings is tied up in your home, and you have a government musing back on taxing that's the sale of that residence to pay for programs we don't need with money that we don't have, I think that should be very concerning. I think the future should be very concerning for Canadians, because we're $400 billion in debt. In the last crisis, the government spent money on building bridges and infrastructure and roads and putting people to work. And they spent $58 billion, and they balanced the budget in 2000 and 2015. We're nowhere near that with these guys.
Thanks. And a minute response from Gary, if you'd like.
Well, I'll just tackle on the infrastructure spending, which is vitally, vitally important. Delighted that amongst lots of housing for vulnerable communities, rental for low income, etc., may not be directly impacting here, but certainly across the GTA is wonderful. The fact that the subway is finally coming north on Yonge Street. I think Melissa and I agree 100% that stop option 3 is the only way to go. Tunneling under people's homes is ludicrous. And it's a shame that Metrolinx and the provincial government haven't quite seen the light, but we certainly hope that they will soon.
Thank you. And so that'll bring us to the end of the audience questions for part of this debate, and just running slightly a few minutes over time, always easier when it's online than in person. We'll close off with the closing statements, 3 minutes each from each candidate, and then some very brief closing remarks from myself. So I believe, I'm thinking back to who went first at the very beginning. I think it was Melissa. Is that your recollection, Melissa and Gary?
It was so long ago, I can't remember now.
Okay, so you know what? I'm gonna flip something over here, and we'll figure out who's going last.
Let's. Can I have an ask the audience?
No, I flipped it already. So
right.
yeah, so Gary will be delivering his closing statement first, and then Melissa, based on my flip.
Well, thank you. I think a lot of what we've discussed tonight and the contrasts have to do with tone. The Liberal Party, I and my team are going to pledge to move forward together an inclusive, positive plan for recovery from the pandemic, both economically and socially, starting with vaccines. Everybody, please, if you're not vaccinated yet, please get vaccinated. If you can't medically, enough of us will be, so that you will be protected appropriately. And I'm really hoping that my opponent can make the same statement and that others from her party will start as well. The Conservatives, as always, nothing's changed, are negative, belligerently and aggressively telling us what they're against, picking fights and sowing divisiveness. You know, look at the protests that are happening right now. They're being, on the one hand, comments are being made by O'Toole quite appropriately, stop, stop, stop. And then rumors are floating around that there are Conservative staffers there. Conservatives are worrying about splitting their vote with the PPC. It's a shame that they and others aren't on this debate. They're absolutely odious, but the splitting of the vote, particularly here in Thornhill, is an indictment of the Conservatives. Conservatives, in my mind these days, when it was the PC, it didn't used to be, aggressiveness, aggression, divisiveness, anger, mean-spirited, vitriol. That's not what I want for my country. I much prefer the direction Liberal Party and I are going, reasoned, inclusive, thoughtful, with realistic solutions. My opponent is a political operative, and it shows. Everything is sport, us versus them. That's not where I come from. I'm a community advocate working with everybody for the common good, working with people to come to common solutions, everybody in the room together. I'm not against everything. I'm for getting things done in a positive way. And with the viewer support and with the support of those in Thornhill, the community will be able to send a strong voice to Ottawa in the Liberal caucus, forming government to make sure that once again, we have a strong voice in government. Those who want to get involved and engaged in my campaign, please vote Gary.ca. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now to close us off, a 3-minute closing statement from Melissa.
I think when you call an election with absolutely no plan, you end up leaning wedge politics. It's exactly what we've seen from the Liberals, and we're at a critical moment in our history. And I think polarization is deeper than ever, and it's you can't denounce it if you're the one that caused it. We're 18 months into a global pandemic, and we're doing the same thing over and over again. I've said that before. I will say it again. The day that Justin Trudeau called this election, a fourth wave of COVID was raging, and the Taliban retook Kabul. That very same week, every single day, incidents of anti-Semitic vandalism took place in our city, in our community. And with all of that, families are falling further behind. Kids can't afford to live where they grow up. And we've reached a point where you need to count the ethical transgressions of this prime minister on two hands. That's unacceptable, and I think voters know it. Your vote in this election will determine the path that we take as a country. The choice in this election has to be about experience, about drive, about ability to lead on key decisions. And quite frankly, I don't think the choice has ever been more clear. We can choose principle and common sense over virtue signaling and capitulating to the woke nonsense that is giving my entire generation a bad rap, and that is a central tenet of this government. So we can choose to have a government that's not afraid to stand up for our values, and we can choose to have an outspoken conservative voice to continue on the leadership that this riding has always played at the federal level. The past 6 years, and especially the past 18 months, have proven that Justin Trudeau is taking Canada down the wrong path. And I think the Liberals released a platform yesterday, halfway through the election, that they called "There isn't one new policy in it." So why are we doing this? Why are we doing this in the midst of why are we doing this with $600 million? But hey, I'll see it as an opportunity. And I think that the platform includes many recycled promises that the Liberals never got around to doing. So they're promising it again. We released a platform on day 2. And it's got everything in it. Canada's recovery plan is going to restore this country back to the best place where we can live, where we can work, where we can raise a family. It's focused on jobs. It's focused on accountability. It's focused on mental health, particularly a mental health action plan that we didn't talk too much about after so many have suffered through this pandemic, through lockdowns, through a raging opioid crisis, and through zero new investment. We are focused on an economy, on balancing the budget in the next day, and I think the choice is very simple. If you want to join me, it's melissalantsman.ca. Choose Melissa Lantsman and the Conservative Party of Canada. Choose a change country.
Thank you, Melissa. And I, in fact, think we should take this opportunity to thank both of the candidates tonight with a big old online round of applause. You can't hear everyone, but I'm sure they're clapping just as loud as I am. So that's going to bring us basically to the end of tonight's proceedings. I just wanted to close by saying, going back to something that both of the candidates said a few minutes ago, which is that this election and every election is an opportunity for the Jewish community in Thornhill and across Canada to make its vote heard. Everybody should vote. If you don't want to vote on election day, luckily this year, 3 out of the 4 advanced polling days are not on Shabbat or Yom Tov, so you should be clear. And as the candidates have also said, I'm sure if there are volunteers who want to go volunteer on the campaign or donate, that's also welcome. It's another way to make your voice heard. And I would add that there are currently 2 more, we might add more, but there are currently 2 more B'nai Brith Canada debates, both of them on the evening of September 13th. And those will be among some candidates in the riding of York Centre, which is, of course, Thornhill's neighbor to the south, and the riding of Winnipeg South Centre, which is where I grew up. So if you're interested in either of those ridings, we'd love to see you there. And otherwise, everyone, please have a great night, stay safe, and we will see you next time.
Shana Tova Tikateva.
Shana Tova.